This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The eyes of the financial world are on the small Mediterranean island of Cyprus today. The government of Cyprus has brokered a last-ditch $13 billion bailout deal with European officials to stave off the collapse of its banking sector. Under the deal, all bank deposits above approximately $130,000 will be frozen and used to help pay off the banking sector's debts. This will result in especially heavy losses for foreign depositors at the Mediterranean islands' banks, many of which are Russian. In addition, Cyprus's second-largest bank will be shut down. Protesters have described the deal as an economic World War III. Some economists say Cyprus is a harbinger of things to come in Europe and possibly even the United States. Cyprus's president described the deal as a painful one, but Europe Group Chair Jeroen Dijsselbloem praised the deal.
The program will be based on ambitious measures in areas of fiscal consolidation, structural reforms and privatization. The authorities will also take decisive action to safeguard the stability of the financial sector, including bank resolution and deep restructuring measures concerning the two largest banks. A levy on deposits across the whole banking sector can and will therefore be avoided.
An earlier version of the deal collapsed last week when Cypriots took to the streets to protest paying a tax of up to 10% on their life savings. The package called on Cyprus to impose a one-time tax on bank deposits as a condition for $13 billion in rescue money. The plan led to mass demonstrations as well as panicked bank withdrawals as Cypriots rushed to protect their savings. On Sunday, the island's central bank imposed a €100 per day withdrawal limit on bank accounts, which led to a fresh round of protests.
If we can take €100 today with what the Eurogroup has decided for the Cyprus nation, we will not have nothing in the coming months and years, and that will be the same for many years. The only solution is to find a solution outside from Troika and the IMF, and stand on our feet on our own, because it looks like our friends in Europe are not supporting us at all.
Well, for more, we're joined right now by Richard Wolff. He's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at New School University here in New York, and hosts a weekly program on WBAI 99.5 in New York City called Economic Update every Saturday at noon. He's the author of a number of books, including most recently, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Richard Wolff, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why is Cyprus so significant?
Well, Cyprus is significant for several reasons. First, it marks an escalation in what we call austerity economics. It is an effort to pay for the cost of this now 6-year-old global crisis in a new way. It is an effort to fund the bailouts of banks in a new way. And the new way was agreed last week by the European forces that control this, the central bank, the European Union, and the IMF, and to impose on Cyprus this new step, which is literally to go into the bank accounts of the citizens of Cyprus, roughly 1 million people in a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and snatch money out of their accounts. See, unlike other austerity, where you levy a tax and you cut back social programs, like we're doing here in the United States, that money dribbles in over a year or longer period. This way, the government can get the money to bail out the banks quickly and cleanly and neatly. Friday night, the people of Cyprus went to bed with a certain amount of money in their accounts, they thought, and Monday morning, last Monday, they were supposed to awake with X% less money because the government had taken it. So that's an amazing new step of austerity. It suggests that this crisis is far from over and that the authorities are desperate to find the money, other than by taxing corporations, other than by taxing the wealthy, in order to solve their problems. The second reason it's important, and you stressed that, is that the people of Cyprus woke up, took one look at this, and said no, and did it dramatically. And in a matter of hours, they undid everything that the European governments and their own government had agreed to a few nights earlier. So it's a demonstration of people power in this little corner of the world that's very impressive and the basis, I think, for some optimism about opposition. How
did they say no?
Basically by saying we're going to disrupt everything. We're not going to go to work. We're not going to consume. We're going to call on our fellow citizens across Europe to recognize that if they can come into our bank account and take our money, then what is exactly going to happen in places like Italy, Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Britain, where very similar situations are playing themselves out? So this call for solidarity around this issue terrified all the other governments of Europe, and suddenly the firmly committed deal unraveled in the face of popular resentment and opposition.
How did Cyprus get to this point?
Cyprus is a small country. Its economy is based on three things. Tourism, it's a very pleasant place for Northern Europeans to go. Shipping, as befits an island. But above all, what is euphemistically called finance. In the go-go years of the 1990s and early in this century, what the banks in Cyprus did is offer themselves around the world as a wonderful place to come and make a deposit. We will convert whatever currency you have into euros, which is a very good currency to have. We will pay you an unusually high interest rate. We will ask no questions. This is often called good banking. So they got a lot of deposits. To give you an idea, depending on the estimates you believe, the total deposits in the banks of Cyprus were 5 to 8 times larger than the total GDP, the total output per year of that economy, which is an absurd situation. And those banks in Cyprus took all those deposits, and then they did what banks are supposed to do: find prudent, safe, non-risky investments. And like all big banks in the last 20 years, they failed. They found bad investments. They didn't do it prudently. They misassessed the risk, and then the banks fell apart. Since that's an outsized part of the Cyprus economy, the whole Cyprus economy, already impacted by this crisis with less tourism and less shipping, now saw its banks defunct, bankrupt basically, and appealed to Europe to bail them out, which is the standard procedure now in Europe as these economies have such trouble.
Despite widespread opposition to the deal by the residents of Cyprus, Cyprus's parliament will not need to approve today's deal with international lenders. That's because the parliament passed the necessary legislation to implement the bailout last week. On Friday, the governor of the Cyprus Central Bank warned political leaders that the country would face a disorderly bankruptcy unless they approved the bailout.
All of the elements that the Central Bank of Cyprus contributed must be voted for immediately, and as they are, for two basic reasons. First, so that a very positive message is sent abroad, which will help in an agreement soon with the Troika. And secondly, it is absolutely necessary that the Central Bank of Cyprus has the right legal tools to allow it to handle the crisis which the Cypriot economy is facing.
Richard Wolff, can you respond?
Yes, this is blackmail. This is basically the officials of the banks and the political leaders going to the mass of people and saying to them, this awful deal that makes you, who had nothing to do with the crisis and didn't get any bailout, pay the costs of the crisis and the bailout. You must do this, because if you don't, we will do even more damage to you and your economy. So give us your deposits, give us your money, pay more taxes, suffer fewer social programs, because if you don't, we will impose even worse on you. It's a basic idea of austerity across the board and in our country too. And I think it's the confrontation of a system that does not work with the mass of the people saying, we will go down and take you with us unless you bail us out.
Explain whose money it is.
It's amazing, you know. The way this works, the plan, which is still on the board, is to go into the accounts of depositors. Remember, a depositor puts his or her money, whether they're a business or an individual, in a bank under the notion that it's guaranteed, it's insured, and it's safe. Otherwise, you wouldn't put your money there. It takes these people's money, thereby destroying all confidence and feelings of insurance or security. And the government will take that money, and the government will then, in the language of these politicians, recapitalize our banks and restructure them Translated into simple English, they're going to take the depositors' money and bail out the banks. In other words, the money leaves the account of the depositor, you and me, and goes into the account of the bank itself. It is the banks, through the government, stealing from their own depositors. It is stunning as an economist to watch it. It's the opposite of a bank guaranteeing your deposit. It's a bank looting your deposit in their own bank. It's an extraordinary study in how extreme this crisis is, that they would have to go to such an extent and risk the blowback that you already see in Cyprus and that is building in other countries as they confront similar measures.
And the significance of the second largest bank being closed?
That's simply an attempt to save private banking. What they're going to do is move much of that closed bank into the other non-closed bank and have the government absorb the losses that are not transferred, so that you can save private banking by reducing 3 or 4 large banks to one fewer by taking the one in the worst condition and basically bailing it out for its mistakes and putting what's valuable in it into the other private banks. It's a refusal to confront that private banking, not just in Cyprus, not just in Greece, but across the world, has driven us into a catastrophe of global proportions, and we're doing everything in our governments to fix this situation without imposing on them, without questioning their failed performance. It's an amazing study in how to solve a problem by refusing to confront its cause.
We're talking to Professor Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, now at New School University in New York, has written a number of books. His latest is Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. We'll go from Cyprus to the economy in Europe and the economy right here in the United States. And what exactly does he mean, a cure for capitalism? Stay with us. Anda, music by pianist, arranger, and composer Bebo Valdez. He died Friday at the age of 94, the son of a cigar factory worker and grandson of a slave. He studied classical music at the Conservatorio Municipal in Havana and became a favorite collaborator with the great Cuban singers of his era, including Benny Moré and Pio Leiva and Orlando Cascarita Guerra, and along with Americans such as Woody Herman and Nat King Cole, was considered a giant during the golden age of Cuban music. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guest is Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, now at New School University, author of a number of books, including Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. I want to talk about austerity here at home. This is House Speaker John Boehner speaking last month defending the $85 billion budget sequester cuts that took effect on March 1st.
The American people know the president gets more money, they're just going to spend it. And the fact is that he's gotten his tax hikes. It's time to focus on the real problem here in Washington, and that is spending.
House Speaker John Boehner. Professor Richard Wolff, your response, and also that the Obama administration was warning catastrophe if sequestration took place. It took place.
Well, it's a stunning comment on our dysfunctional government built on top of a dysfunctional economy. Here we are in the middle of a crisis. We have millions of people without work, millions of people losing their homes, an economy that doesn't work for the vast majority. The United States government is one of the major customers for goods and services in America. Sequestration is simply a cutback in government spending. It doesn't take rocket science to understand that if the government, as the largest single buyer of goods and services, cuts back on the goods and services it buys, that means companies across America will sell less, and they'll have less need of workers, and they will lay off workers. So this is an act that worsens an unemployment that is already severe. If you put that together with the tax increase on January 1st, and let me say a word about that. We heard a lot of public debate about taxing rich people, not taxing rich people, Republicans and Democrats. But the tax on the wealthy is small compared to the tax on the middle and lower incomes that went up on January 1st. When we raised the payroll tax here in America from 4.2 to 6.2%, we raised over $125 billion, huge amount of money, much more than was raised by taxing the rich. And we savaged the middle and lower income groups in America, those that in the presidential election both candidates had sworn to save and support. We attacked them, thereby limiting their capacity to buy goods and services because we taxed them more. You put together the taxing of the middle and lower incomes with the cutbacks of government spending, and you're going to do what every European country that has imposed austerity has already discovered. You're making the problem worse. So with all the homilies that Mr. Boehner can put out there about how spending is a problem, this abstract idea doesn't change the fact you're making the economic conditions of the mass of people worse by these austerity steps, not better. And that ought to be put as the fire burning at the feet of politicians so they stop talking these abstractions and deal with the reality of what they're doing.
So what do you think needs to be done?
A radical change in the policies. And I think it has to go far beyond simply reversing this austerity program, which, again, just for a word about history, back in the 1930s, the last time we had a breakdown of our capitalist system like this, we didn't have austerity. We didn't have cutbacks. We had the opposite. Roosevelt, in the middle of the 30s, created the Social Security system, went to everybody over 65 and said, I'm going to give you a check for the rest of your life. He created the unemployment compensation system, giving all the unemployed for the first time checks every week for a year or two, and he created a public employment program and hired millions of workers. It's the opposite of austerity. So any politician who says we must do this because there's no option has forgotten even the American history of not that long ago. So the first thing I would do is go in that direction. Not austerity, but its opposite. But I want to go further because I think our problem is deeper. This crisis wasn't supposed to happen. When it happened, it wasn't supposed to last a long time. All of that has been proven false. The problems run deep, and I think what we have to do, and what that book tries to do, is to talk about reorganizing our economy so that for the first time we can say, we're not only going to get out of this crisis, we're taking the kinds of steps that can prevent us from having them over and over again as our unstable, business cycle-ridden economy keeps imposing on us. So for me, it's the more profound change that we finally have to face. Painful as it is, after 50 years of a country unwilling to face these questions, I think we need basic change, and that's what I spend most of my time stressing.
Before we talk about the basic change, democracy at work, as you put it, what could Obama do without congressional support right now?
Well, I think in many ways he could initiate a public employment program. I think it's long overdue that he find all the ways available to him to say what Roosevelt said. And not that Roosevelt did everything correctly, and not that he's a genius or any of that, but to take some lessons from those people in our country before who took steps that were successful.
I mean, Roosevelt didn't plan on doing this when he first took office. Absolutely.
He had pressure from below. The CIO, the biggest union organizing drive in American history, never had anything that successful before.
As an AFL-CIO.
That's right. And with the socialist and communist parties who were strong at that time, working with them, they organized millions of Americans into unions who had never joined a union before, and they pushed from below in a very powerful way. And they changed Mr. Roosevelt, showing that politicians, if subject to pressure from below, can change. Same lesson that Cyprus has just taught us yet again. So my response is learn from that. Roosevelt went on the radio to the American people and said basically, if the private sector either cannot or will not provide work for the millions of Americans that need and want to work, then it's my job as president to do it. And he did it. And I think Mr. Obama could and should overcome whatever has made him hesitate. We in this country not only don't have a federal employment program, the Republicans and Democrats haven't even put it on the floor to debate it as an important issue, even though it comes out of our own history. So I would say, put our people to work. They want to work. The Federal Reserve says 20% of our tools, equipment, factory, and office space is sitting idle, unused. So we have the people who want to work. We have the tools, equipment, and raw materials for them to work with. And Lord knows we need the wealth they could produce. Put them to work and make it a national issue that happens.
Where does the money come from?
Well, Roosevelt went to the wealthy and he went to the corporations and he said to them, you must give me the money to take care of the mass of people, because if you don't, we're going to have a catastrophe in this country. We're going to have a social revolution. My argument is, let's go back to the same tax rates that Roosevelt imposed, or at least in that neighborhood, which is much higher on wealthy people and much higher on corporations than we have today. That's what he did. That's how he funded it. And in case our politicians are worried, let's remind them. Mr. Roosevelt, who took those daring steps, was reelected to be president 4 consecutive times, the most popular president in American history. It's not a dead-end political decision. It's the best decision a president could make to leave his legacy in history that we are told our presidents care so much about.
We're talking to Richard Wolff, author of Democracy at Work. Again, before we talk about democracy at work, I wanted to go to a recent hearing in Washington. Executives with the banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase appeared before a Senate panel earlier this month to answer questions around the so-called London whale trades that cost the bank more than $6 billion and derailed financial markets worldwide. This is Arizona Republican Senator John McCain criticizing J.P. Morgan's actions.
J.P. Morgan completely disregarded risk limits and stonewalled federal regulators. It is unsettling that a group of traders made reckless decisions with federally insured money, and that all of this was done with the full awareness of top officials at J.P. Morgan. This bank appears to have entertained, indeed embraced, the idea that it was, quote, too big to fail.
Ashley Bacon, J.P. Morgan's interim chief risk officer, testified at the same hearing.
I don't think it is too big to fail. I think there's further work that needs to be done to demonstrate and document that, and it's in process. I'm not leading that process or deeply involved in it, but I think it's something that needs to be demonstrated to everybody's satisfaction.
That was Ashley Bacon, J.P. Morgan's interim chief risk officer. Can you explain what took place here and what is happening?
Yes. On the question of too big to fail, there really isn't much to say. In 2008, our banks failed, all of them, the way the Cyprus banks failed, and for very similar reasons. They took in a lot of depositors' money, and they made risky bets they shouldn't have made, and they failed, and so they didn't have the money to honor their obligations, and they turned to the government for a bailout. And when the government hesitated, because it's public money, to bail out a privately failed bank, they were told, in another kind of blackmail, we're too big to fail. If you don't bail us out, we will collapse and take the entire economy with us. And that was a persuasive argument, particularly after they allowed Lehman Brothers to fail, and that nearly did take the economy with it. That was a convincing argument. You would have thought they had then learned the lesson about the problem of a too-big-to-fail financial institution. If you thought that, you would have been wrong, because the same banks that were too big to fail in 2008 are all of them bigger today. So we didn't learn the lesson. We didn't break up the banks. We didn't control their growth. They're bigger now than they were then. And in a sense, maybe shame on them the first time. But having allowed this to happen, it's shame on us. Number two, We seem to need, as a nation, to believe that we have the power to control, limit, or regulate, whether it's the Glass-Steagall Act that came out of our disaster of the 1930s, or the Dodd-Frank Act, which came out of the disaster that started in 2008. We seem to want to believe we can leave in place private banks, no matter how big they are, and hedge them about with regulations. The proof of the whale trades in London, the proof of everything we know is that these banks have the money, the staff, the resources to work their way around the regulations at least as fast as we impose them on them. That's what these hearings fundamentally show. They can make trades that are too risky. They can lose wild amounts of money. They can turn to the government and demand to be helped and bailed out each time, and they get it. We are telling them, in a classic example, look, do whatever you want. You don't have any risk of fundamental failure and punishment. Regulation doesn't work because we leave in place an entity, a large corporation, with the money and the incentives to get around it.
Interestingly, Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, did not testify. He was brought before the Senate, about last June, where the senators were asking him for advice. And then when you looked at the senators on the Senate committee and how much money J.P. Morgan Chase had given each of them, we're talking about millions of dollars went to many of them.
When I say that the big corporations, particularly the banks, have the resources and the incentives, I'm being polite. Yeah, part of the resources are going into literally making sure that the political regulator is a good friend and understands the complexities. In simple English, they are buying their way into the situation we watch, which is we will pretend to be regretful, you will pretend to be protecting the public, you will make regulations that we help you write so that we can get around them. It is something that ought not to be allowed to continue because we're living the economic crisis that comes from that way of doing business.
What lessons have been learned since 2008 and today? Could the U.S. see the same situation as Cyprus?
Absolutely. We have banks that are literally telling us, because we know from our controls, that they are trying even to regenerate it. They're trying to get people to borrow more money again. We're not changing the wage structure of America, which means that Americans are required to go into debt to supplement their wages. You know, the irony is, we are trying, in the language of some of these folks, to kickstart our economy, to get it going again. But the problem is, our economy was a train heading into a stone wall in the first years of this century. And if we get our economy going again without fundamental changes, what we're doing is putting that same train back on the track, heading towards the same wall. Cyprus shows us what's happening, but we don't have to take just small countries. Take Great Britain, our classic ally. Their economy is now in the second, or in some people's minds, the third recession within the crisis since 2007. They are following an austerity process exactly like that supported by Mr. Boehner, and the economic downturn in Great Britain is catastrophic for that society. And so we have this image of a future for us if we don't make fundamental change, but everyone wants to put it away and pretend that we can let it go by itself or a few regulations will solve the problem. They haven't. They're not doing it now elsewhere. That's not a strategy we should pursue in this country either. When we come back, we'll talk to Professor Richard Wolff about the alternatives, about, well, what he's put forward, democracy at work, a cure for capitalism. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Professor Wolff in a minute.
Y aunque tú me has deseado en el abandono, y aunque tú has muerto mis ilusiones, en vez de maldecirte con justo encono, y en mis sueños te colmo, y en mis sueños te colmo de bendiciones. Sufro la inmensidad inmensa pena de tu extravío. Siento el dolor profundo de tu partida y lloro sin que tú sepas que el llanto mío tiene lágrimas negras como mi vida.
Lágrimas Negras, or Black Tears, by Bebo Valdez and Diego El Cigala. Bebo is an Afro-Cuban piano player, one of Cuba's finest musicians of all time. He died Friday at the age of 94. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue with Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at New School University here in New York, does a weekly program on WBAI in New York called Economic Update every Saturday at noon. His latest book is Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. So what exactly do you mean by this?
What I mean is a change in the enterprises that produce the goods and services we all depend on and provide the jobs we all need and want. I think those have to be, in a fundamental way, democratized. So let me begin in that way. We live in a country that says it goes to war around the world to bring democracy and that its central, most important political value is democracy. If you believe that, and I am a fervent supporter of democracy, and obviously you are, you've named your program that way, then we ought to have democracy in the place where we as adults spend most of our time. 5 out of 7 days we go to work. We walk into a place where we use our brains and our muscles 8 or more hours, 5 out of 7 days. If democracy is an important value, it ought to be right there first and foremost. But we don't. We basically have a situation where for most of us we go to work in a place where the decisions that are made by a tiny group of people. The major shareholders who own the block of shares in our system select a board of directors, 15 to 20 people, and they make the basic decisions. What to produce, how to produce it, where to produce it, and what to do with the profits. The rest of us must live with the results of that decision. So if that tiny group of people make a decision to close the factory in Cincinnati or the office in Atlanta and move to Shanghai, the chips fall where they may. If they decide to use a toxic technology that's not good for the air and water but is good for the profits, they do. We live with the results. And when they decide to take the profits of their business and to give enormous pay packages to a handful of top executives and big dividend payouts to the shareholders, which of course they do since they're in a position to do it, and the rest of us suddenly have to take out absurd debts to get our kids through college, then that's the inequality of income and wealth that we have in America. So I look at this decision-making apparatus. I say, why are we surprised that they make the decisions the way they do? We all live with the results, and we have no say in how those decisions are made. It's not democratic. That's the first thing. But the second thing is we're now in 5 years of economic crisis that indicate that way of organizing the decisions doesn't work for the mass of people. It works for them. The stock market's back. The profits of big corporations are back. Surprise, surprise, given who makes the decisions. But we're left. And so for me, the solution is let's face this. Let's build an option, a real choice for Americans between working in a non-democratic, top-down organized capitalist enterprise, or in what, for lack of a better term, we can call cooperatives, workplaces that are organized democratically. I think we'll have less inequality of income, we will have less pollution of our environment, and we'll have less loss of jobs out of the country if those decisions were made by the people, as they should have been from the beginning, who will not make the kinds of decisions that got us into the mess of economic crisis that we're in now.
In June, you wrote a piece, Richard Wolff, in The Guardian called Yes, There is an Alternative to Capitalism. Mondragon shows the way. Mondragon, Spain's renowned co-op, where all enterprises owned and directed by co-op members. At the Green Party's convention last year, the keynote speaker, Gar Alperovitz, said the Mondragon model is being replicated here in the United States. I want to just turn to a clip of what Gar Alperovitz said, the professor of political economy at the University of Maryland.
So in Ohio, the idea of worker ownership is a bigger idea. Lots of people understand it. And in Cleveland, building on the Mondragon model, some of you know about the Mondragon model, and other ideas, There are a series of worker-owned integrated co-ops in Cleveland in a neighborhood where the average income is $18,000 per family. And they've got these co-ops not just standing alone, but linked together with a nonprofit corporation and a revolving fund. The idea is to build the community and worker ownership, not just make a couple of workers rich, or to say the least not rich, but to build a whole community, and to use the purchasing power of hospitals and universities, tax money in there, Medicare, Medicaid, education money, buy from these guys and build the community. That model, and it's the greenest, from one of the things, the greenest laundry in that part of the country, that uses about a third of the heat, about a third of the electricity, and about a third of the water. They're on track now to put in more solar capacity that exists, one of the other worker-owned companies that exists in the entire state of Ohio. These are not little dinky co-ops.
That was Gar Alperovitz talking about the Mondragon model here. And when we were in Spain, Democracy Now! Went to Mondragon and interviewed one of the cooperative members, and we'll link to that at democracynow.org. But Richard Wolff, talk about that model and what's happening here.
Well, the model of Mondragon is so interesting, not only because it's a real co-op where the workers make the decisions, what to produce, how, where, what to do with the profits. And just to mention one of their achievements, they have a rule that the highest paid worker cannot get more than a maximum of 8 times the lowest. In our society, and it's typical in our large corporations, that the CEO gets 300 to 400 times what the lowest worker. So for those of us that are interested in a less unequal society than what we have here in America, the lesson is, if you cooperatize your enterprise, that's a sure route to get there, and we haven't found any other route that is just as effective. So the importance of Mondragon is they start in the middle of the 1950s with a Catholic priest, Father Arizmendi, I always have to remember it, with 6 workers in the north of Spain, desperately trying to overcome the unemployment there. And here we are, over a half a century later, having to compete with countless capitalist enterprises. They won that competition. Trying to grow, they have a growth record that would be the envy of any capitalist corporation. They went from 6 workers in 1956 to 120,000 workers today in Spain.
And they are making?
And they are making everything. They make dishwashers, they make clothes washers, they raise rabbits on farms, they do high-tech research together with General Motors and Microsoft as some of their partners there. They do an immense array. They're really a family of 200 to 300 co-ops that are united within the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. So they've shown the ability to grow, they've shown the ability to adapt, they've shown their competitive power, they've shown all the different ways that a corporation can develop without a top-down hierarchical undemocratic structure. So we don't have to choose between effectiveness, growth, jobs, security, and a cooperative structure. The cooperative structure can be a way to get there. Here in the United States, we have lots of such co-ops developing. There's one even named after Father Arizmendi. In California, in the Bay Area, there are 6 Arizmendi bakeries and coffee shops that were set up on that model. They started with 1, they're now 6. Hint, they've grown. And you can do this, and all over the United States, there are these efforts, often done by people who want a different kind of life. They want to be in charge of their own job. They want to have a sense of control and a sense that they're not just a drone doing the work, but they're part of the folks who design and direct. It brings out new capacities. It makes you happier to go to work. It's a more satisfying job life than you would otherwise have. So I think it recommends itself on all kinds of levels. One other example, we can learn something from a country called Italy that we admire for its cuisine and its lovely countryside. They have a law there passed in 1985 called the Marcora Law, after the name of the legislator. Here's what it does. It offers a choice to unemployed workers. You can take a dole every week, an unemployment check, the way we do in this country, or you have an option B that we don't have. If you get at least 9 other workers to make the same, unemployed workers like yourself, to make the following choice, here's what you can get. As a lump sum, you can get your entire unemployment program of 2 years of checks in your hands right at the beginning. You have to have 9 other workers or more. and you have to use that money as the startup capital for a cooperative enterprise. The idea of the Italian government was, if we give workers this to set up a job and an enterprise, they will be much more committed to it than they would if they didn't have that role.
How do they know they'll do it?
They don't. But they know those workers have an incentive, because if they don't make that work, they can't go back and collect unemployment. That's what they got. The government doesn't spend much more money than it would have anyway, but it creates jobs, and it creates workers committed because it's their enterprise to make that work as their personal solution and as a way not only for them to survive, but for the whole of the Italian society for the first time to see what it's like to have an enterprise where you run the affair. You know, here in America, we want to believe in freedom of choice. Let's give our people freedom of choice. They can have the choice to go work in a top-down capitalist enterprise, what we're used to. But if we developed the alternative, really a program of co-ops around the country, then American young people and older people could say, what would it be like to work there? Let's see what that's like. And then we would have the choice we do not have in this country now.
Professor Wolff, before we end, I want to turn back to the crisis in Cyprus and relate it to what's happening here. Bill O'Reilly of Fox News warned his audience last week that Cyprus and other European countries are facing economic hardships because they're so-called nanny states.
Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, now Cyprus, all broke. And other European nations are close. Why? Because they're nanny states. And there are not enough workers to support all the entitlements these progressive paradises are handing out.
And that's Bill O'Reilly of Fox News. Richard.
You know, he gets away with saying things which no undergraduate in the United States with a responsible economics professor could ever get away with. If you want to refer to things as nanny states, then the place you go in Europe is not the southern tier, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. The place you go are Germany and Scandinavia, because they provide more social services to their people than anybody else. And guess what? Not only are they not in trouble economically, they're the winners of the current situation. The unemployment rate in Germany is now below 5%. Ours is pushing between 7 and 8%. So, please, get your facts right, Mr. Riley. The nanny state, you call it, the program of countries like Germany and Scandinavia, who tax their people heavily by all means, but who provide them with social services that would be the envy of the United States. A national health program that takes care of you, whether you're employed or not, and gives you proper health care. In France, for example, the law says when you go to work, you get 5 weeks paid vacation. That's not an option. That's the law. You get support when you're a new parent for your child care and so forth. They provide services. And they're successful in Germany and Scandinavia, much more than we are in the United States, and much more than those countries in the South. So they're not broke in the South because they're nanny states, since the nanny states par excellence are doing better than everyone. The actual truth of Mr. O'Reilly is the opposite of what he says. The more you do nanny state, the better off you are during a crisis and to minimize the cost of the crisis. That's what the European economic situation actually teaches. He's just making it up as he goes along to conform to an ideological position that is harder and harder for folks like him to sustain, so he has to reach further and further into fantasy.
In our last minute, other cures for capitalism, as you put it.
Well, I think that there's a set of fundamental reorganizations. When you have a private banking system in the United States, the way we did up until, say, the 1970s and 80s, you had it in a position relative to the economy that made a certain sense. But over the last 30 and 40 years, for a whole host of reasons, we have made debt a central part of the economy. Today, it is not unusual for a person who goes into a grocery store to get a bottle of water to use a credit card, basically to make a loan in order to buy that bottle of water. Everything that consumers do is now mediated by debt. Everything corporations do, and as we look around the world, the governments are in debt. Debt is everywhere. It has become the water we swim in, the air we breathe. That puts the banks in an unbelievably powerful position because they're the repository of the means to borrow. If we're going to make an economy dependent on debt, we can't leave the power to control that
we have 10 seconds.
In the private hands of banks. Either we don't become a debt-ridden country or we make borrowing and lending, a social program. We can't allow private banking. It doesn't work. It needs to be changed.
Richard Wolff, I want to thank you for being with us. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Richard Wolff is Professor Emeritus at University of Massachusetts, teaches at New School University. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.